you have to really reassess. That's something I certainly have learned. 20 years since the last remastering, there's just been so many different changes in the way that people hear things. I'd call it a necessity.
Jimmy Page built Led Zeppelin into a legend, but behind the riffs and the roar, secrets stayed buried for decades. Now, at 82, the silence is finally breaking. What he is revealing is shocking fans worldwide. What did he hide for so long? What truth changes everything we thought we knew? Join us as we uncover the confession no one saw coming. The House of Secrets. Jimmy Page is 82 years old now. His hair is white, his face is lined with decades of living, and the electric guitar that once shook arenas sits mostly silent these days. He lives in a house in Holland Park, London, that most people walk past without a second glance. The man himself, the one who built an empire out of music, mysticism, and carefully guarded secrets, has spent most of his life saying very little. That was always the plan. Silence was his weapon. Mystery was his brand. While other rock stars chased headlines and gave endless interviews, Page pulled back. He watched, he controlled, he let the rumors grow because rumors kept people curious, and curious people kept watching. For 50 years, it worked perfectly. But something is different now. Those who have been close to Page recently describe a man in a quieter season of life, reflective, slower to guard himself, more willing to let small truths slip through the cracks. This is not the sharp-eyed architect of Led Zeppelin's empire. This is something rarer. This is Jimmy Page with his walls slightly down. And what is emerging from behind those walls is not what most people expected. It is not just nostalgia. It is not a greatest hits memory tour. It feels heavier than that, more personal, almost like confession. The house in Holland Park holds many secrets, and so does the man inside it. Why is a man who mastered silence finally starting to speak? The power of withholding. Most rock stars want to be seen. They want the cameras, the interviews, the magazine covers, the constant flood of attention that comes with fame. Jimmy Page wanted something else entirely. He wanted control. From the very beginning of his career, Page understood something that very few artists ever figure out. That mystery is more powerful than visibility. That what you hide draws people in deeper than what you show. While his contemporaries were busy talking, Page was busy watching, calculating, deciding exactly how much of himself the world was allowed to see, and the answer was, not much. He rarely gave interviews, and when he did, his answers were careful, measured, designed to reveal just enough to satisfy, without actually giving anything away. He spoke about music with passion and depth, but personal questions hit a wall every single time. Fans and journalists alike walked away from conversations with Page feeling like they had been given a gift without realizing the box was actually empty. It was a masterclass in persona management. Even his stage presence was built around withholding. He would stand at the edge of the light, half in shadow, drawing the audience toward him rather than stepping forward to meet them. His guitar solos were conversations, full of tension and release, giving the crowd just enough before pulling back again. Everything about a Jimmy Page performance felt deliberate, even the moments that looked accidental. Off stage, the mystique ran even deeper. He surrounded himself with symbolism, with imagery pulled from ancient traditions and occult philosophy, with a visual language that raised questions nobody could fully answer. His home was filled with rare books and artifacts. His wardrobe was theatrical without being explained. His personal life was kept behind doors that simply did not open for outsiders. People talked about him constantly, precisely because he gave them so little to work with. And that was the genius of it. Fame built on exposure fades when the exposure stops. But fame built on mystery compounds over time. It grows in the gaps. It feeds on imagination. It becomes something much larger than any single person could manufacture through interviews and appearances alone. Jimmy Page did not become a legend by showing the world who he was. He became a legend by making sure the world could never quite figure it out. Everything about Jimmy Page was intentional, even what he never said. The guitar that chose him. Nobody handed Jimmy Page a future in music. He found it on his own, in the most unexpected way. He was about 12 years old when he came across a guitar left behind by a previous tenant in his family home in Epsom, Surrey, a quiet suburban town on the outskirts of London. The instrument was battered and old, not exactly the kind of thing that announces itself as life-changing. But Page picked it up anyway, turned it over in his hands, pressed his fingers against the strings, and felt something click into place. There were no lessons, no teacher, no structured path forward. He taught himself entirely by ear, listening to records over and over, slowing the music down in his head, figuring out where the fingers needed to go by feel and instinct alone. He was obsessed in the way only certain people get obsessed, where the thing they love stops being a hobby and starts being the only thing that makes complete sense. Blues music hit him hardest.
In effect, I was in a group and we were doing sort of blues music, and the chess catalogue we were playing a lot of.
The raw emotion of American blues, artists like Scotty Moore, James Burton, and later the electric pioneers who were reshaping the sound of a generation, found their way into his ears and refused to leave. He absorbed everything, not just the notes, but the feeling behind the notes, the tension, the longing, the way a single bent string could say something that words never quite could. He rejected formal structure almost entirely, while other young musicians were learning from sheet music and following rules. Page was building his own internal language, one that came from instinct rather than instruction. Teachers bored him, scales felt like cages, and the idea of playing music the correct way held no interest for someone already playing it his way. By his early teens, Page was already remarkable. People who heard him play during those years described something unusual. A technical ability that should not have existed in someone so young, combined with an emotional depth that felt far beyond his age. It was not just talent, it was a particular kind of hunger, the kind that does not switch off. The guitar had not simply given him a skill, it had given him an identity, a purpose, and a direction that would shape everything that followed. But one moment of honesty revealed a completely different boy beneath all of it. The last honest answer. In 1957, a 13-year-old Jimmy Page appeared on a BBC television program called All Your Own, a show that featured young people with unusual talents and hobbies. He performed, he impressed, and then the host asked him a simple question. What do you want to do when you grow up? The answer was not music, it was not fame, it was not electric guitars or sold-out arenas or becoming one of the most iconic figures in rock history. The boy sitting in front of the camera looked quietly at the host and said he wanted to do biological research, that he wanted to find a cure for cancer. It shocked people then, and it still shocks people now, because it was so completely unexpected and because it felt so genuinely true, unguarded, unperformed. The kind of answer a child gives before they learn to manage how the world sees them. There was no calculation in it, no persona, no mystery, just a young boy sharing something real about who he was and what he cared about. That version of Jimmy Page would not be seen again for a very long time. Not long after that television appearance, music tightened its grip on him completely, and the boy who dreamed about science quietly stepped back into the shadows while the musician stepped forward to take his place. The transformation was not dramatic or sudden. It happened gradually, the way most important changes do, through small decisions made over months and years that slowly added up to a completely different person. The mask, as those close to him would later describe it, began forming around this time. Not a mask of dishonesty exactly, but a mask of control. A carefully managed distance between the private person and the public figure. A deliberate choice to keep the real Jimmy Page tucked away somewhere safe while the world got the version he was willing to share. It was a choice that would define his entire career. The vulnerability of that BBC moment, the openness, the simplicity of a boy with a real dream, became something he seemed to protect fiercely in the decades that followed, as though showing it again might cost him something he could not afford to lose. After this, the real Jimmy Page disappeared from public view, the invisible hitmaker. Before Led Zeppelin, before the myths and the mansions and the sold-out stadiums, Jimmy Page spent several years doing something that almost nobody knew about, and that was exactly the way he preferred it. He became a session musician. In the early 1960s, London's recording studios were running at full speed, churning out singles for pop acts, folk artists, beat groups, and everything in between. Producers needed reliable, talented players who could walk into a studio, read the room, and deliver exactly what a song needed without fuss or ego. Page became one of the most sought after of those players, slipping quietly in and out of sessions for artists whose names were far more famous than his own. The list of recordings he appeared on during this period is staggering. He played on tracks for Donovan, Tom Jones, Shirley Bassey, Val Doonican.
I played on Goldfinger.
That's
But Shirley Bassey came into it was rehearsed by John Barry, and Shirley Bassey comes into the studio, and she goes to the mic, she just does one take.
And dozens of others, contributing guitar parts that shaped the sound of some of the biggest records of the era. Most listeners had no idea he was there. His name was rarely on the sleeve. His face was never in the promotional photographs, and he collected his session fee and disappeared before anyone thought to ask too many questions. They called him Little Jim in those circles. It was a nickname that carried real affection, because despite his youth, he was already operating at a level that made older, more experienced musicians stop and pay attention. Producers trusted him completely. They would describe what they needed in the loosest possible terms, and Page would deliver something better than what they had imagined, quickly, cleanly, without drawing attention to himself in the process. He was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. And while that invisibility might sound frustrating for someone with genuine talent, Page seemed to thrive in it, absorbing everything the studio environment had to teach him, learning how records were constructed from the inside out, understanding the technical architecture of sound in a way that most guitarists of his generation simply never had the opportunity to discover. Every session was an education. He was learning how producers thought, how arrangements were built, how the smallest sonic decision could change the emotional weight of an entire song. He was filing all of it away, quietly, patiently, building a knowledge base that would eventually give him an edge that went far beyond guitar playing alone. The world was getting hit after hit from artists it adored, never once suspecting that a young man named Jimmy Page was standing just out of frame, shaping the sound of a generation without ever taking a bow. Why would someone this influential choose to stay invisible? The exit before the explosion. There comes a point in certain careers where the work that made someone extraordinary starts to feel like a cage. And for Jimmy Page, that point arrived somewhere in the middle of the 1960s, quietly and without much ceremony. Session life had given him everything he needed to grow: the studio experience, the technical knowledge, the deep understanding of how popular music was actually built rather than simply performed. But it had given him almost nothing he needed to feel creatively alive, because session work, by its very nature, belonged to someone else. He was always playing other people's music, other people's visions, other people's ideas. The producer decided the direction, the artist got the credit, and Page walked away with a fee and the private knowledge that he had contributed something significant to a record the world would love without ever knowing his name. For a while, that arrangement had suited him. It kept him learning and earning while the rest of the world figured out what it wanted from rock and roll. But the satisfaction was running out. Those close to him during this period describe a growing restlessness, a sense that the invisible role he had mastered so completely was starting to feel less like a strategic choice and more like a limitation. He was one of the most technically gifted guitarists working in London, and he was spending his days making other people's recordings shine, while his own musical identity sat completely unexpressed. The burnout was not loud or dramatic. It crept in slowly, the way burnout usually does, through small accumulations of frustration, through sessions that felt mechanical rather than inspired, through the creeping awareness that the gap between what he was capable of and what he was being asked to do had grown into something he could no longer comfortably ignore. So he made a decision. He began pulling back from the session circuit, turning down work that would previously have been automatic, creating space in his schedule and in his mind for something he had not yet fully defined, but could feel taking shape somewhere just below the surface. It looked like a retreat to those watching from the outside. It looked like a talented musician stepping away from a successful career without any obvious plan to replace it. But Page was not retreating. He was preparing. Every session he turned down was a door closing on someone else's vision, and every door that closed brought him one step closer to the moment when he would finally be free to build something entirely his own, on his own terms, answering to nobody. He was not disappearing, he was building. The Led Zeppelin master plan. Most people who were there in the beginning will tell you that Led Zeppelin felt like lightning, spontaneous, electric, impossible to predict or explain. But the deeper you look at how the band was actually constructed, the more a very different picture begins to emerge. Nothing about Led Zeppelin happened by accident. By the time Page began assembling the band in 1968, he already had a clear and detailed vision of what he wanted to create, not just musically, but structurally, not just as a sound, but as an empire.
Nothing whatsoever to do with the band. I knew what I wanted to do, and I knew exactly how to go about doing it.
He had spent years inside the recording industry, watching how it worked, watching where artists lost control of their music, their money, their image, and he had made a private decision that none of those things would ever be taken from him. He chose his bandmates with surgical precision. Robert Plant was brought in as a vocalist with raw power and emotional range that could match the scale of what Page was planning. John Paul Jones was recruited as a musical architect whose bass and keyboard work could anchor even the most adventurous arrangements. And John Bonham was identified as a drummer whose physical approach to the kit would give the band a rhythmic foundation unlike anything else in rock music at the time. Together, they were extraordinary, but Page was the designer. The business decisions were equally deliberate. He pushed for the band to sign directly with Atlantic Records under terms that gave them unusual creative freedom. He helped establish their own management structure through Peter Grant, a formidable presence who understood Page's vision completely and protected it with absolute ferocity. Most bands of the era handed control to the label and hoped for the best. Led Zeppelin operated differently. They kept control of almost everything. The music itself was constructed to defy easy categorization, blending blues, folk, Eastern influences, hard rock, and pure improvisation into something that critics struggled to define and audiences could not resist. Page produced every album, shaping the sound from the inside, making decisions about texture and space and volume that reflected a deep and considered artistic philosophy rather than commercial calculation. Even the mythology was managed, the refusal to release singles in the United Kingdom, the resistance to mainstream television appearances, the cultivation of a live reputation so powerful that the records almost felt like souvenirs of something much larger. All of it fed a machine that Page had designed to run on its own terms. Led Zeppelin was not a band that got lucky. It was a plan that worked. What felt spontaneous to the world may have been perfectly engineered all along. The symbols and the shadows. There was always something else running underneath the music, something darker, stranger, and harder to explain than guitar riffs or album sales, and anyone who looked closely enough at Jimmy Page's world eventually found themselves staring at it. Page had a serious and lifelong interest in the occult, not in the casual decorative way that some rock musicians flirted with dark imagery for shock value, more aesthetic effect, but in a deep, studied, genuinely committed way that went far beyond performance.
I was very interested actually in Eastern and Western mysticism, and I spent time reading and researching when I was younger.
He was a devoted student of Aleister Crowley, the British occultist who had spent his life constructing a philosophy of personal will and hidden power, and whose reputation was so controversial that most people in polite society refused to say his name without lowering their voice. Page did not lower his voice. He collected Crowley's original manuscripts, rare books, and personal artifacts with the dedication of a serious scholar, building one of the most significant private collections of occult material in the world. He eventually purchased Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness in Scotland, a property that Crowley himself had once owned and used for magical rituals, a detail that Page made no effort to hide and seemed to take quiet satisfaction in sharing when asked. The symbolism bled directly into the music. His personal symbol, the now famous Zoso, was not a random design or a decorative flourish. It was a carefully chosen sigil drawn from occult tradition, carrying meaning that Page consistently refused to fully explain, despite decades of questions from fans and journalists. Each member of Led Zeppelin had their own symbol printed on the inner sleeve of their fourth album, but Page's carried a weight and deliberate obscurity that set it apart entirely. The tarot was another thread running through his work. The imagery on the fourth album, including the iconic figure of the hermit standing alone on a mountaintop holding a lantern, was drawn directly from tarot tradition, and Page's involvement in selecting and shaping that imagery was active and intentional. He understood the visual language of esoteric symbolism and used it to layer meaning into the band's work that casual listeners would feel without ever being able to name. Some dismissed it as theater, as elaborate decoration designed to make the music feel more dangerous and mysterious. But those who studied Page more closely consistently described a man whose interest in these ideas was genuine and private, something he pursued not for effect, but out of real intellectual and spiritual conviction, whether the audience was watching or not. He was not just performing, he was signaling to those who knew how to read the language he was speaking. The silence that won't break. There are questions that have followed Jimmy Page for decades, questions that surface every few years in interviews and documentaries and online discussions, questions that he has never directly answered and whose continued presence in the conversation says something that words alone cannot quite capture. The 1970s were a complicated time for Led Zeppelin. The band was at the absolute peak of its powers, selling out the largest venues in the world, releasing albums that rewrote what rock music was capable of, generating a level of cultural hysteria that very few artists in any era have ever matched. But running alongside that extraordinary success was a shadow life, one involving excess in behavior that, seen through the lens of the present day, raises serious and uncomfortable questions. Allegations regarding Page's relationship with a 14-year-old girl named Lori Maddox have circulated for many years. Maddox herself has spoken about the relationship in interviews, describing encounters that began when she was a teenager and Page was in his late 20s, a grown man at the height of his fame and power. The allegations are specific, they are documented in multiple sources, and they have never been disputed, clarified, or addressed in any meaningful way by Page himself. He has simply never spoken about it, in an era where public figures are increasingly expected to account for past behavior. That silence carries enormous weight. It fills the space where an explanation or acknowledgement might otherwise sit, and it leaves the conversation permanently unresolved. Journalists who have attempted to raise the subject in interviews describe the same experience in a subtle but unmistakable shift in Page's demeanor, a door closing behind his eyes, and then nothing. The subject does not exist in his public narrative. For some of his defenders, the silence is a form of dignity, a refusal to engage with allegations they believe are being weaponized by a culture applying modern values to a different era. For others, the silence is itself the most telling response available, louder in its absence than any direct statement could ever be. What makes it particularly striking is the contrast with the rest of his legacy. Page has been willing, in recent years, to speak with surprising openness about his creative process, his influences, his relationship with the music, even his personal struggles with the darker periods of his life. But this particular territory remains completely sealed, untouched, surrounded by a silence so consistent and so deliberate that it feels less like forgetting and more like a decision made long ago and never revisited. At 82, with nothing left to lose, why does the silence still hold? Kak the day. The music died. On the 25th of September, 1980, John Bonham was found dead at Jimmy Page's home in Windsor, having consumed an extraordinary amount of alcohol. And with that discovery, something far larger than a single life came to an end. Led Zeppelin was over. The band announced it formally not long afterward, releasing a short statement that said, continuing without Bonham was something they were not able to consider. And for Page, those words carried a weight that went far beyond professional loss. Bonham had been more than a drummer. He had been the rhythmic soul of everything Page had built, the physical force that made Led Zeppelin's music feel like something happening inside your chest, rather than simply in your ears. The grief was real, and it was deep. Those around Page during the months that followed describe a man who was not simply mourning a colleague, but struggling to locate himself without the creative universe that had defined him for more than a decade. Led Zeppelin had not just been his band, it had been his identity, his purpose, the structure around which every other part of his life had been organized. And without it, the days had a shapelessness that he seemed genuinely unprepared for. The attempts to move forward were difficult and mostly unconvincing. He contributed to the soundtrack for the film Death Wish 2 in 1982, formed a short-lived project called The Firm with Bad Company vocalist Paul Rodgers in the mid-80s, and released a solo album called Outrider in 1988. All projects that had their moments, but none of which came close to capturing the scale or the electricity of what had come before. The music world noticed the gap, and so did Page. There were occasional reunion gestures, a brief and troubled appearance at Live Aid in 1985, a one-off performance at the Atlantic Records' 40th anniversary concert in 1988, collaborations with David Coverdale and later with Robert Plant that produced genuinely interesting work, but never resolved the deeper question of what Jimmy Page was supposed to be now that the thing he had built so carefully was gone. He had always been the architect, the designer, the man with the plan, and now the building he had spent his life constructing had simply ceased to exist, leaving him standing in the space where it used to be, holding tools he was not sure how to use anymore. The greatest creative partnership of his life was finished, and some part of him, those who knew him best would quietly suggest, never fully accepted that it was not coming back. Imagine knowing that your greatest moment is already over. The man left behind. The version of Jimmy Page that exists today is quieter than the one the world spent decades trying to decode, and those who have spent time around him in recent years describe something that feels genuinely surprising given everything that came before. He seems, by most accounts, at peace. The drinking and the excess that swallowed large portions of his middle years are behind him, replaced by a steadier, more considered way of moving through the world. He speaks about his health with awareness, about his habits with honesty, and about the darker chapters of his life with a reflectiveness that would have been almost unimaginable from the controlled, guarded figure who once turned mystery into a professional strategy. A significant part of that shift is attributed to Scarlett Sabed, the poet and filmmaker who became his partner in his later years, a relationship that raised eyebrows given their age difference, but which those close to Page describe as genuinely stabilizing, a connection that brought warmth and creative companionship into a life that had for too long been defined by solitude and control. She gave him something the music never quite could, ordinary closeness. In interviews from this period, Page speaks differently than he once did. There is less armor in his words, less careful management of what gets through, more willingness to sit with a question rather than deflect it. He talks about legacy with a complexity that suggests he has thought about it deeply and privately for years, acknowledging greatness without the defensiveness that once surrounded every public appearance. The walls are not completely down. Some rooms remain locked, some silences remain unbroken, and certain questions still find the same closed door they always have. But something has shifted in the man behind the myth. Something quieter and more human has begun showing through the gaps, and the world is watching carefully, leaning in, wondering whether what is emerging is the truth Jimmy Page was always carrying, or simply the final, most elegant version of the story he chose to tell. What part of his story touched you most?